Okay, happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture on rangeland game bird management. So let's start off with taking a look at what's coming up, what's due, and where it's located between Canvas and Top Hat. So if you go to the modules page on Canvas, and you scroll down to our human dimensions model down at the bottom here, you'll see that week 6 now you have your Game Birds Abroad homework, which was posted with some that you need to answer. We also have now study guide and questions posted for exam 2. The list of questions that I will take from the exam is on Wednesday. It's closed book, and class time you need to during class time on Wednesday. So that's 12 to 12 U.S. Central Time. Okay, so if that's a problem for you, please contact me and we can make another arrangement. All right. So there's also a link that has exam 2 session survey. So if you click that, you'll see a link to a when to meet survey here. So select that. It'll take you to a page that looks like this. And to select your availability, which I'm going to do right now, you just click and drag on the time slots, okay? When it'll ask for your name, you can provide your name and the password. You don't have to put anything, and then you'll be able to select, like I just did, your availability. So we'll try to choose a time that most people can attend, but I will also record the review session. That is going to be done through Zoom. I'll send some more information out about that once we set a time. Okay, so let's get started on today's topic. So the game bird of the day today is the oriental turtle dove, or Streptopelia orientalis. There's 6 subspecies of this bird, and as you can see, it has a really wide distribution in Asia. So their habitat use actually somewhat mirrors that. They use a very wide, diverse range of habitats, everything from boreal forest to tropical habitats. These have very different temperatures and levels of precipitation, as well as their vegetation structure. They've been recorded using everything from birch trees to oak to mixed deciduous, bamboo, scrub habitats, which is sort of shrubby, wooded farmland, sparse woodland, mountainous regions, forest edges. They're pretty much everywhere. They're starting to become more adapted to urban settings as well as development continues. Some populations migrate and others stay as year-round residents, which you can see in the distribution map on the lower right of your screen. And in some regions, their breeding season is really long, May through August. Like most other pigeons and doves in this family, they build a pretty crappy nest. It's kind of just a loose, flimsy nest of twigs, kind of stacked into a small platform type. And they usually will nest about 2 to 4 meters above the ground. They'll choose some sort of sapling or shrub or even bamboo to build their nest in. They lay 2 white eggs, like most doves and pigeons. They only lay 2. Sometimes they'll only lay 1. There's a really short incubation period compared to other doves, only about 15 to 16 days, compared to 21 to 28 days in other species. Unlike a lot of our galliforms, their chicks are not precocial, they're altricial, so they're born without any feathers and they're blind and, pretty scrawny, ugly little naked things. So they do have to give quite a bit of care to the chicks in the nest before they fledge, which they'll fledge after hatching somewhere between, I believe, 16 days or so. Okay, so that is our game bird of the day. So back to the announcements and reminders. Respond to that when to meet poll by midnight tonight. The exam is the next class period, as I said, Wednesday during class time. It's the same format as exam 1. It's going to be closed book. Covers all the material in the human dimensions model, including what we'll talk about today. There are also some post-check questions due today by midnight, along with the Game Birds Abroad homework, which, as I showed you, can be found on Canvas. So that's also due by midnight tonight. So let's get into the material. So we're going to cover, last time we covered some forest management for game birds and thought a little bit about how that works, how we manage forest for wildlife. Now we're going to kind of jump over to rangeland. And there's a question on Top Hat that I'd like you to go on and answer, which is the first question. It's embedded in your slides in the folder for today's material. And that is, what is rangeland? We need a definition, right? So go ahead and answer that question if you haven't already before you continue. Okay, once you've answered the question, here's the answer. So what is rangeland? Well, rangeland is plant communities that are dominated by grasses, forbs, and or shrubs, or some mixture of those. In the United States, and honestly most of the rest of the world, they're primarily lands that are used to produce livestock. So they're managed for, or were originally managed almost exclusively for grazing. If you have a career in rangeland ecology and management, which is what I did my master's degree in, you manage not only wildlife, but you're also a lot more interested in the plant community itself, the soils, the water, and the grazing and browsing animals, whether they're domestic or wildlife. So there's a question on Top Hat about the definitions of grasses, forbs, and shrubs, which you can fill out and see if you know what those are. But grazing animals are animals that choose food that's herbaceous completely, so grasses and forbs, whereas browsing refers to animals that are eating off of shrubs, so woody vegetation. So there is a distinction between the two. Now, the grazing management strategies that are used to manage these livestock affect the quality and the quantity of habitat that's available for our game birds. And here in the US, the majority of our rangelands are public land, and they're sort of administered by the US Forest Service as well as the Bureau of Land Management. And both of these agencies have what we call a multiple use mandate. That is, they are required to manage that public land, those rangelands, for multiple uses, whether that's recreation and grazing leases, whether it's livestock and wildlife viewing, or whatever the case may be. They manage for multiple uses. So now you can go ahead on Top Hat and answer that question about the rangeland components, and this deals with the definitions of what's a grass, what's a shrub, and what's a forb. Okay, so in rangeland management in the US, the biggest shift has been a shift away from focusing solely on that predator-livestock interaction that we learned about through Aldo Leopold, where there were predator bounties because of the fear of livestock losses. So we've shifted away from focusing only on predator-livestock interactions and big game livestock interactions. That would be something like competition between deer and cattle for forage. So now we have shifted away from that, toward a focus on biodiversity and the ecosystem as a whole, and allowing for our livestock and our wildlife to coexist in a way that's productive, so that the ranchers can still make a profit to support themselves. That's their livelihood, but we can also do our best to support native wildlife and plant communities. So rangeland management is focused a lot on wildlife as well as those other things that I mentioned, the soil and water and all that good stuff. And particularly game birds. The rangeland management focuses all on habitat structure. And we've talked about this several times throughout this class. So what do I mean when I say habitat structure? Well, that refers to the vertical plant structure or the canopy structure. And believe it or not, prairies do have canopies. They're just way down by the ground compared to a forest. But you can have multiple layers of grasses and multiple canopies in a prairie ecosystem. It's just very small scale. So it's that vertical plant structure as well as the vegetation density. So how thick the vegetation is. And that's really important for game birds because that is concealment from predators for the birds themselves, but also for their nest, right? because there's lots of critters out there that love to eat eggs. So we want to focus on the food items that are available. That's part of habitat structure, and that is related to the plant species composition. Species composition refers to what percent of little bluestem, what percent of Kentucky bluegrass, what percent of big bluestem, what percent of smooth brome makes up my plant community. We also need to think about adequate quality and quantity of water. Now, a lot of the game birds here in the US really do not require free water being a body of water, just sitting there like a pond or a lake or a stream. Most of our North American game birds get pretty much all of their water from their food items. So they're consuming vegetation and seeds which have water content in them already, and they don't really need to drink. But that's not always the case. When you look at a lot of species that are in more arid regions, desert birds, they actually do require free water often somewhere. Where livestock is involved, rangeland management also we need to think about the interaction between wildlife and livestock still. So we do still think about that today, obviously. So these are components of habitat structure that we need to consider when we think about rangeland management and game birds. Now there's a question that I would like you to, a discussion actually on Top Hat. So what kind of interactions can you come up with between wildlife and livestock? What is an interaction that may come about? And remember, this could be bidirectional. We might have positive interactions between them, and we might have negative interactions between them. So take a minute and do a little brainstorming and post some of your ideas on Top Hat, or if someone else has already posted it, you can go ahead and like their answer. And then when you're done, we'll continue. Okay, so you should have done that brainstorming. So now let's talk about some wildlife-livestock interactions. Can be behavioral avoidance of the livestock by wildlife, or attraction. So believe it or not, some bird species are actually attracted to grazing cattle. For example, the cowbirds, they love to follow cattle around, and they'll eat the bugs that follow cattle around, due to the manure and due to the cattle themselves. So situations like that, or they might be wildlife that avoid them. They're disturbed by the activity, so they'll actually leave the area, which is kind of interesting because once you put cattle into a pasture, if they're new there, you'll see, pronghorn and deer maybe move off to avoid them, but over time, the wildlife kind of gets used to the cattle being around, and then you might actually see them interacting together, grazing in the same area. There's also mortality to consider. So this could be direct mortality through the destruction or trampling of nests or individuals. There have been accounts of cattle who are very curious. They're like big dogs, actually picking up game bird chicks in their mouths, sort of to explore them, and actually killing them accidentally. They're not picking them up really to consume, they're just curious, and they end up injuring the chicks. But that's, fairly rare. But we do have to consider that there might be direct mortality as a result of cattle. The cattle might step on the nest and destroy the eggs. They might trample fledgling chicks that can't fly very well yet. And then there's also indirect mortality. And this has to do with, the parasites and disease issues that might arise due to the livestock. So in the US, the rangeland can be managed by different agencies for different uses, and that includes some areas that have sort of special area designation. So this can be challenging to navigate from a management or conservation perspective, because you might have properties that abut each other that really are the same kind of habitat, but because they're managed by different agencies or for different uses, perhaps the management is not consistent. But some of these agencies are the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Forest Service, wilderness areas, sanctuaries, wildlife management areas, refuges, and special research areas are some of those special designation that rangelands often have. Now, you should have seen on your rangeland question that the rangeland category is somewhat a catch-all for everything that's not forest in a lot of ways. So it doesn't include farmland, but it does include grazing land. It includes wetlands, shrubland, desert, scrub, all kinds of different types of land cover get lumped into this range management category. So let's think a little bit about the context of succession in range. So plant succession and game bird management goals for rangeland. Now, talked about succession now is the gradual replacement of one plant community with another over time. So as the community shifts and your habitat structure changes, the value of the habitat to any individual game bird species will also change. And that also means that it changes for any other wildlife or any grazing or browsing animal, domestic or otherwise. So we see with plant succession, sort of a succession of wildlife along with it as it progresses, shifts forward, has disturbance, shifts back. Now, only some of the plants available in any rangeland are useful for any particular species, right? Only a subset of the biomass is actually useful, for our game birds. So we need to consider what they need and what is available. The other thing that is important to note about succession is that the energy required to move sort of forward in succession is not the same amount of energy required to move backwards, right? So we think of this plant succession as sort of a natural progression through these stages, and that when you go from, bare ground to grassland to maybe some shrubs coming in to shrub dominated to tree dominant, that's sort of forward through succession. That's a relatively easy sort of natural progression that occurs without a lot of energy input. Disturbance, however, to move back, that's a lot of energy requirement. And this is really, really important to note if you're managing rangelands, because if you let that plant succession get to a certain point, the amount of time and energy and money that you're going to have to put into it to shift it back is going to be, many-fold over what's required for it to achieve that new stage in the first place. So going backwards sort of requires a lot of energy. And in rangeland habitats, of course, this is important because we're trying to keep them in these earlier successional stages. So rangelands do exist in many different successional stages and habitat structures. And I'd like you to kind of brainstorm a little bit what these successional stages and this habitat structure is influenced by. So on Top Hat Go On, there's a rangeland structure discussion, and you can post your ideas on there before you continue. So, as I mentioned, succession is this gradual replacement, and some of the influences on succession in rangeland include things like it's your disturbances, right, that we've already talked about. It's fire, it's herbicide treatments, it's mechanical disturbances, being physical disturbances of the environment. It's grazing, and it's also planting or interseeding, which sometimes we do to increase our diversity of plants. So most plant communities and species respond to grazing and fire or other methods of defoliation in a predictable manner. So that would include things like mowing. So we can sort of predict what's going to happen as we make our management plan. So with increased or decreased pressure from these influences, you can cause the plant community to shift directionally. So this is mainly how rangeland managers do their work. If you add more grazing, you're going to shift your plant community toward more grazing tolerant plants, and they're often less palatable species for grazing. You're moving away from species that are superior competitors in the absence of disturbance. So keeping grazing heavy for a long period of time, you continue to push that, you might see new exotic plant species start to take over, such as the non-native thistles, spurges, brome grasses, and these are all very well adapted to heavy grazing. And you see that the overall range condition declines, meaning the palatability for grazing animals declines. The amount of available biomass that's good for cattle or wildlife declines. So we have to basically manipulate the disturbance regime in order to shift things the way we want them to shift. Sorry, that was my dog in the background. Okay, so range condition used to be assessed based on how close that range was to some stable peak plant community. And this was known as the climax community. So we used to compare what was there to the climax community and ask how similar are they. And the problems with this approach is that it cannot be used on seeded rangeland. So if we've planted for plant diversity, and it also can't be used on those that are now dominated by introduced or naturalized plant species, like smooth brome, which is an exotic introduced species, but it's now sort of naturalized in the United States. It's everywhere. It's not going away. You can't really compare that community to, some hypothetical climax community, because it's probably stable as smooth brome and not going to change much, but that doesn't mean that it's high quality range condition. So we would rate the range condition by excellent, good, fair, or poor in terms of how it was in providing forage for livestock. So the problem with this, again, from our perspective, looking at game birds, is that this rating often doesn't mean anything in terms of range condition for wildlife, right? So just because it's excellent forage for cattle does not mean that it's appropriate habitat for prairie chickens. So there's been a move to kind of go away from those terms for livestock forage and put it in wildlife context. So we're going to use these terms climax community still, late, mid-cereal, and early cereal stages, right, to refer to the range condition. So as I said, these climax communities are relatively stable. They no longer change much. So that's sort of your end point of succession. And in my opinion, this is a somewhat outdated term, because what community nowadays is stable? We talk about ecology as being dynamic, as changing. Ecosystems are dynamic. How can we ever really call any particular environment stable? So this idea has kind of fallen out of vogue with a lot of ecologists. And I'm one who kind of thinks that it's the idea of climax communities can be useful in certain contexts, but it's a bit outdated. So just be aware that, some ecologists sort of argue with this terminology. But anyway, let's look at these wildlife terms. Late cereal, mid-cereal, and early cereal. So the cereal stages refers to the series of plants. So remember, cereal-like series. The series of plants occurring due to succession from bare ground to the climax community. So early cereal would be, bare ground and early colonization by grasses. Mid would be your middle successional stages. So where you have established grassland, you might start having some shrubs coming in, or you might be shrub dominated. And then sorry, my dog. And then late cereal stages would be when we start getting into maybe the bigger wooded plants, forest, that kind of thing. So these terms are somewhat interchangeable with early successional, mid-successional, and late successional, right? So that's what that means. We love jargon in science. I don't know why, but let's take a look throughout the cereal stages. The appropriateness for different organisms changes, right? So if you look at this figure, you can see along the bottom axes, the x-axis, that we have C, which stands for climax community, LS for late cereal, MS for mid cereal, and ES for early cereal. So basically, the climax community, the endpoint is on the left, and you're going sort of back to early cereal, which would be your grass dominated, etc. And then we have all these different, metrics here. We've got forage biomass, so how much food is out there for grazing, cattle stocking ability, pronghorn density, erosion, bird density, and small mammal density. And as you look at this graph, look at all the different changes. Some of them go together, some of them are complete opposites, and some of them are, totally different shapes than any other that was measured in this particular site in southern New Mexico. So the shape of these curves will change based on where in the country you are, what is the rangeland you're looking at, and all kinds of things. So you can see that as we move from the climax community back to early successional habitats, the bird density goes up. The small mammal density, you have some optimal density in the middle, so at mid-cereal, between mid-cereal and late cereal. The pronghorn density also has some optimum at late cereal stages, which pretty much matches that of cattle. Whereas the forage biomass, this makes perfect sense, right? The forage biomass is the highest in the climax community and the lowest in early cereal. Now, the forage that you're interested in can change, obviously, and that shape is not going to be the same in types of ecosystems, right? So this variation between different, groups of species can make it extremely difficult for us to plan for multiple species. So we need a way to categorize things productively. So what are some of the rangeland management models that are being employed to help us with this? So one, we can group species by important characteristics. So we ask two questions. Where does it feed and where does it reproduce? Because these are critical life history stages or occurrences, right? So I want you guys to look at an example community and try to categorize them. So on Top Hat, you will see a group question. You have unlimited responses, so you can kind of treat it as a chat discussion board with your team, and you've been randomly assigned. And I want you to categorize these Nebraska game bird species based on these two questions, right? There's an example to look at on there. So you're gonna ask, where does it feed and where does it reproduce, and put them in different categories. So those two questions go together. So each different type of feed/reproduce is going to go in a separate category. So you might have, ground nester, ground feeder is a category, ground nester, water feeder is a category, and so on and so forth. So complete that activity on Top Hat. So you should have completed that now. So what are some of the challenges that you realized about this model as you were thinking about that with the aid of the information available on allaboutbirds.org? So challenges of this model are that if you're focusing on biodiversity in general as your goal, there's a lot to consider. And you're probably still going to have to prioritize certain species over one another. And sometimes the species you want to prioritize require completely opposite management. So for example, wild turkeys require, a late cereal stage. They like big trees. They also like some edge habitat, farmland. That is completely different than what greater prairie chicken and what sharp-tailed grouse want. They want tons and tons of open grassland. They do not want trees, right? So if you're trying to manage as a game bird manager both of those species, you have to have some way to decide, or you have to spatially set them apart. So the other challenge is that these two questions are a good start, but we might miss key habitats if we only focus on where it breeds and where it feeds. So things like thermal cover and predator refugia, or places for them to hide from predators, can be very, very, very important for game birds. Everything loves to eat quail and pheasants. Lots of hawks. So if we're not considering those sort of special needs, we might miss out on key habitats. So let's look at a second model. And this second model, instead of kind of categorizing the wildlife, we're actually categorizing the rangeland, usually by their nutritional carrying capacity. So we're asking this question of how many of the species can this land support? And then we aim to manipulate that number up or down as we outline our goals. But the problem with this, of course, as a challenge, is that these models tend not to account for sort of varied nutritional needs among individuals. When you're calculating this nutritional carrying capacity, it's treating all individuals as if they have the exact same nutritional needs, which we know is definitely not accurate in the real world. Egg-laying females need more calcium. Individuals that are sick or have high parasite loads need more nutrition. Birds recovering from injury need more nutrition. Molting, breeding males with varied levels of testosterone are going to be different in their nutritional requirements and how much energy you're using. And just different levels of stress in our birds can affect their nutritional needs. So quail in Nebraska in a harsh winter, they need a lot more food than quail in Nebraska in a mild winter. So that was kind of a rapid overview of sort of some of the range management models. There are some habitats in the U.S. that are of special concern. Sorry, my dog is whining. And this includes riparian areas, montane meadow habitats, aquatic habitats, sagebrush steppe, which is critical for sage grouse, which we're going to talk about in detail next week, I believe. And then also desert and aspen groves are sort of believed to be declining due to rangeland management, fire suppression, all kinds of climate change, all kinds of stuff. So let's look at some of the techniques that we can employ. And like I said, remember, all we're trying to do is we're manipulating succession. And so we're going to control disturbance as much as possible and do disturbance in the direction that we want. So this can include manipulating the timing and duration of grazing. It can be manipulating the types of livestock. Believe it or not, all livestock and all grazing and browsing wildlife do not eat the same ways. The way they defoliate the plants or remove the tissue from the plants is different, and that can affect your rangeland management. So for example, horses graze very differently than cattle. And again, if you're interested in that, there's tons of information out there about this in sort of range studies. So kind of fascinating that something as simple as how the animal removes the plant tissue can actually affect your rangeland management. Of course, prescribed fire. Timing is very important. Mowing or haying, that's another form of plant defoliation. Mechanical manipulation is big. So this is, what we as managers go out and physically do to the rangeland environment. So this can be using hand tools. Maybe you're clipping brush. Maybe you're digging stuff up. Maybe you are, chemical spraying, or maybe you're using heavy equipment to do some of the hard work, particularly for brush management. So as you can see on your screen here, we've got undisturbed rangeland on the left, and then on the right, it has been mowed and cut down this mountain big sagebrush in a bunchgrass plant community. And this is taken from southeastern Oregon. And that is a very striking example of rangeland management in action. So you can also see on the bottom right what happens with woody plant encroachment into grasslands. And then if we do brush management activities, you can push it back through succession the other way. So there's a really cool video that I'll let you guys watch if you want on brush management that shows you one of the techniques used, which is really cool, called chaining, where you actually use bulldozers and you string this enormous chain between them and it pulls across the land, it snaps off the brush and kills them and opens back up some of that ground. So that is it for today. Make sure that you are answering that survey, and I will post the post-check questions as well. And if you guys have any issues, go ahead and shoot me an email, and we can figure it out together. All right, bye guys.